The spring of 1967 smelled like possibility and diesel fuel. At least, that's how Curtis Warner would remember it years later. That peculiar scent that hung over farm country when the implement dealers rolled out their new inventory and every farmer in 3 counties suddenly felt like their equipment wasn't quite good enough anymore. Curtis was standing in his driveway on a Saturday morning in April when his neighbor Mike Shepard pulled up in a brand new Ford pickup. Not the farm truck Mike had been driving for 6 years. This was showroom fresh, still had the temporary tags in the window. Mike climbed out grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "Curtis, you gotta come see what I just did." Curtis set down the wrench he'd been using to adjust the carburetor on his 1952 Farmall M and walked over, wiping his hands on a shop rag. New truck? New truck, new tractor, new everything. Mike was practically bouncing. "Just signed the papers this morning. Come on, ride over to my place. You gotta see this." Curtis hesitated. He had work to do, fields to prepare, equipment to maintain. But Mike looked so excited that Curtis found himself climbing into that new truck, smelling the factory-fresh interior, hearing the engine purr like a satisfied cat. 5 minutes later, they pulled into Mike's farmyard, and there it was. A John Deere 4020, gleaming green and yellow under the April sun. 95 horsepower, power steering, 8-speed transmission, everything a modern farmer could want. "Isn't she beautiful?" Mike said, running his hand along the hood like he was petting a prize horse. "She's something," Curtis agreed. "What did you end up trading?" "The old 730. They gave me $3,200 for it. This one's $4,800, so I financed the difference plus the truck. Dealer worked out a hell of a package. Got it down to $400 a month for 5 years. Curtis did the math in his head. $400 a month times 60 months. $24,000 for a tractor and a truck. "That's a lot of money," he said carefully. "That's the cost of progress, buddy." Mike climbed up into the seat, fired up the engine. The sound was smooth, powerful, nothing like the mechanical clatter of the older machines. "This thing's going to cut my field time in half. I'll be able to take on more acres, increase production. It'll pay for itself in 3 years, easy." Curtis looked at that shiny new tractor and felt something he didn't like feeling, something that sat in his chest like a stone. Envy. Not because Mike had a new tractor, but because Mike had the confidence to believe it would all work out. The optimism to think that borrowing $24,000 was a smart investment. The certainty that bigger and newer and more powerful was the path to success. Curtis didn't have that certainty. Never had. "What about you?" Mike asked, shutting down the engine. "When are you going to upgrade that old Farmall? Thing's got to be 15 years old by now." 17, Curtis said. "Bought it in 1950. "Exactly. That's ancient. You should talk to the dealer. They're doing some great financing deals right now. You could probably get into something decent for $300 a month." Curtis thought about his 1952 Farmall M. Thought about the fact that it was paid for, that it started every morning, that he could fix damn near anything on it with basic tools and parts he could find at any farm supply store. "I'll think about it," he said. But he already knew he wouldn't. "Now, before we go any further, I need to tell you something important. This story isn't going to go the way you think it's going to go. This isn't just about one farmer keeping his old tractor while his neighbor bought new. This is about a decision that would change the map of an entire county. About how one man's discipline became another man's disaster. And about the day Curtis Warner became the largest landowner in 3 townships without ever taking out a loan. If that sounds like something you want to hear, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next is going to show you exactly how wealth gets transferred from the impatient to the patient. Over the next 6 months, Curtis watched as his neighbors, one after another, made the same choice Mike Shepard had made. Bill Ketchum bought a new International 1206, financed the whole thing. Ray Thornton bought a new case, 10:30. Payments of $350 a month. Dennis Cole bought a new John Deere 4320 and a new combine. Borrowed $35,000. It was like a fever had swept through the county. Every coffee shop conversation, every Sunday after church, every meeting at the grain elevator, farmers were talking about their new equipment, comparing horsepower, bragging about features, planning for the increased production that would justify the increased debt. Curtis kept his mouth shut and kept farming with his 1952 Farmall M. People noticed. "When are you going to get with the times, Curtis? Can't afford new equipment? You're going to work yourself to death with that old junk." Curtis's wife, Margaret, heard the comments too. Heard them at the grocery store, at the beauty parlor, at the PTA meetings, the subtle implications that the Warners couldn't keep up, that Curtis was too cheap or too stubborn or too old-fashioned to modernize. One evening in October, after a particularly difficult day of listening to other farm wives talk about their husbands' new equipment, Margaret came home and found Curtis in the barn, doing maintenance on the Farmall. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Not buying new like everyone else?" Curtis looked up from the oil change he was doing. "Regret what?" "Being the only one still farming with old equipment, being the one everyone talks about." Curtis set down his oil filter wrench, wiped his hands. "You know what I regret? I regret that we're not going to Hawaii this Christmas." Margaret blinked. "What?" "I was talking to Mike Shepherd yesterday. Asked him if they were doing anything for the holidays. He said they can't afford to go anywhere because they've got equipment payments to make. $400 a month doesn't sound like much until you realize it's $400 every month for 5 years. That's $4,800 a year. That's a nice vacation every year for 5 years." He paused. "So no, I don't regret not having a shiny new tractor. I regret that we're not going to spend Christmas on a beach in Maui. But we could. That's the difference." Margaret smiled. "I don't need Hawaii." "I know, but it's nice to know we could if we wanted to. That we have choices. The guys with the new tractors, they don't have choices anymore. They have payments." The wheat harvest of 1968 was good. Prices were decent, yields were strong, and farmers across the county had one of those years that makes you remember why you got into agriculture in the first place. Curtis cleared about $8,000 after all expenses. Good money for a farm his size. Mike Shepherd cleared about $12,000. Better money, sure. But after equipment payments, Mike netted about $7,200. Curtis had cleared less, but kept more. The difference didn't seem significant at the time. It was only a few $100s, hardly worth mentioning. But Curtis understood something that Mike didn't. He understood compound effects, understood that small differences repeated over time become massive advantages. That extra money Curtis kept, he didn't spend it. Put it in savings, kept building his reserve, kept creating a cushion between himself and disaster. 1969 brought drought. Not the worst drought in living memory, but bad enough. Yields dropped by 30% across the county. Wheat prices stayed flat, and suddenly farmers who'd been comfortable in 1968 were scrambling in 1969. Curtis had a tough year, cleared maybe $4,000, tightened the belt, cut back on non-essentials, got through it. Mike Shepherd had a worse year, cleared maybe $6,000 gross. After equipment payments, he netted about $1,500, had to dip into savings to cover his operating costs for the next year. Other farmers were in similar positions. The new equipment they'd bought in 1967 wasn't making them more money in a drought year, wasn't increasing yields when there wasn't enough rain, wasn't raising prices when the market was flat. But the payments didn't care about drought. The payments came due every month, regardless. Curtis watched and said nothing, just kept farming. 1970 was better. Rain came back, yields recovered, prices ticked up slightly. Farmers breathed easier. Then 1971 brought grasshoppers, clouds of them thick enough to darken the sky. They ate everything green they could find, and farmers scrambled to spray and replant and salvage what they could. Curtis lost about 40% of his crop, had another tough year, but he got through it. Mike Shepherd lost about the same percentage, but Mike was also trying to expand, trying to justify his equipment investment by farming more acres. When the grasshoppers hit, his losses were proportionally larger. He cleared maybe $3,000 that year. After equipment payments, he actually went negative. For the first time, Mike Shepherd missed a payment, called the bank, worked out an extension, got back on track. But something had shifted. The confidence Mike had shown in 1967, the certainty that his new equipment would pay for itself, that had started to crack. Here's what I need you to understand, and this is critical to everything that happens next. Debt is leverage. It amplifies both success and failure. In good years, debt allows you to make more money faster. But in bad years, debt destroys you faster too. And farming, if you've been doing it long enough, is a series of good years and bad years that nobody can predict. Curtis Warner understood this. His neighbors didn't, not yet. If you're seeing the pattern here, if you're starting to understand where this story is going, leave a comment and tell me what you think happens next, because what's about to happen changed everything. 1973 was the year everything broke. The oil embargo hit in October and diesel prices tripled almost overnight. Suddenly, farmers who'd budgeted for fuel at 30 cents a gallon were paying 90 cents. Big tractors with powerful engines were burning 60, 70, 80 gallons a day during peak season. Mike Shepherd's 4020, with its 95 horsepower engine, was drinking fuel like a drunk at an open bar. His fuel costs for the 1974 planting season were nearly 3 times what they'd been in 1973. Curtis's 1952 Farmall M, with its smaller engine and simpler design, barely noticed. His fuel costs went up, sure, but not catastrophically. Then wheat prices crashed in late 1974, dropped from $4 a bushel to $2.40. Farmers who'd planted expecting one price were harvesting at another, and the math didn't work anymore. Curtis had a bad year in 1975, cleared maybe $3,000, tightened his belt another notch, kept going. Mike Shepherd had a catastrophic year. Between fuel costs and equipment payments and the price crash, he actually lost money. Went to the bank looking for an operating loan to get through to the next season. The bank said no. The first foreclosure notice came in January of 1976. Mike Shepherd tried to fight it, tried to negotiate, tried to find a way to restructure his debt. But the numbers didn't work. He owed too much. The equity in his farm wasn't enough to cover what he'd borrowed, and the bank wasn't interested in working with him anymore. By April, Mike Shepherd's farm was on the auction block. Curtis Warner stood in the back of the crowd on the day of the sale, watching as Mike's equipment got sold off piece by piece. The 4020 that had looked so beautiful in 1967 went for $1,800, less than half what Mike still owed on it. The land sold separately, 320 acres of good ground, farmhouse, barn, outbuildings. Opening bid was $50,000. Curtis raised his card. Someone else bid $55,000. Curtis bid $60,000. The other bidder shook his head, backed out. Going once, going twice, sold to Curtis Warner for $60,000. Curtis paid cash. Money he'd been saving for 9 years while his neighbors were making equipment payments. After the auction, Mike Shepherd found Curtis near the parking area. Mike looked like he'd aged 20 years in the last 6 months. Face gaunt, eyes hollow, shoulders slumped in a way Curtis had never seen before. "I guess you were right," Mike said. "About the tractor, about the payments, about all of it." Curtis didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry it worked out this way." "Are you? You just bought my farm for half what it's worth." "It's worth what someone's willing to pay for it, and I'm paying what I can afford." Mike looked at him for a long moment. You know what the worst part is? It's not losing the farm. It's knowing that one decision, one choice I made in 1967, that's what did this. If I'd kept my old 730, if I'd just said no to the dealer, if I'd been as smart as you were, he trailed off. It wasn't about being smart, Curtis said quietly. It was about being scared. I was scared of debt, scared of owing money I might not be able to pay back. So I played it safe. Safe won, Mike said. Then he walked away. Curtis never saw him again. Word was, Mike and his wife moved to Wichita, got jobs in town, never came back to farming. But Mike Shepard wasn't the only one. Over the next 3 years, between 1976 and 1979, 6 more farms in Curtis's county went into foreclosure. All of them had bought new equipment on credit in the late 60s. All of them had expanded and modernized and tried to compete. All of them had been crushed by the combination of high fuel costs, low crop prices, and debt payments that never stopped. Curtis Warner bought 3 of those farms, paid cash for all of them. By 1980, Curtis owned 1,100 acres, had gone from a modest 280-acre operation to one of the largest farms in the county. And he'd done it without ever taking out a loan, without ever financing equipment, without ever following the advice of the implement dealers who said you had to spend money to make money. He'd done it by being patient, by living below his means, by saving instead of spending, by keeping his old Farmall running when everyone else was buying new. Let me pause here and ask you something, because this is the moment in the story where everything crystallizes. How many opportunities are you missing because you're too busy making payments? How much wealth could you build if you stopped spending money on things that lose value and started saving for things that appreciate? Leave a comment with your thoughts. Because this question, this exact question, it's what separates the Curtis Warners from the Mike Shepards. The expansion changed Curtis's operation fundamentally. He couldn't farm 1,100 acres with a single 1952 Farmall M and a prayer. He needed more equipment. So he went to farm auctions, estate sales, foreclosure sales. He bought a 1956 Farmall 450 for $1,400, bought a 1960 International 560 for $1,800, bought a used combine for $4,000, bought implements and trucks and all the pieces he needed to run a larger operation. Total equipment investment for tripling his acreage, about $15,000, all paid in cash, all bought at auctions from farmers who'd overextended themselves. Meanwhile, farmers who were still operating were buying new equipment to farm their remaining acres, still taking on debt, still believing that the next new tractor, the next technological advancement, would be the thing that finally made them profitable. Curtis just kept farming, kept maintaining his equipment, kept living modestly, kept saving. By 1985, he owned all 1,100 acres free and clear, every acre paid off. No land debt, no equipment debt, nothing. He was 53 years old. His 1952 Farmall M was still running, 33 years after he'd bought it. Still started every morning, still did work. Curtis had become wealthy, not by making more money than his neighbors, but by spending less and saving more, by resisting the pressure to upgrade and expand and modernize, by understanding that ownership beats appearance every single time. In 1987, a young farmer named Kevin Ross came to Curtis looking for advice. Kevin had just inherited 80 acres from his grandfather and was trying to figure out how to get started. "Everyone's telling me I need to finance equipment," Kevin said, "that I can't compete with old junk, that I need modern machinery to make it work." Curtis was in his shop, rebuilding the carburetor on his 1956 Farmall. He looked up, smiled. "How old are you, Kevin?" 24. "You got any money saved?" "About $6,000. "Then here's what you do. You buy the best used tractor you can find for $3,000. You spend $2,000 on implements. You keep 1,000 for operating costs, and you farm your 80 acres without owing anybody a dime. But what if the tractor breaks down? Then you fix it. You learn how it works. You become the kind of farmer who doesn't need a dealer or a mechanic because you can solve your own problems. Kevin looked skeptical. Everyone's farming 1,000 acres now. How am I supposed to compete on 80? Curtis set down his tools. You're asking the wrong question. You're not trying to compete with the 1,000-acre guys. You're trying to survive long enough to buy their land when they go under. Kevin blinked. What? I bought 1,100 acres by being patient and debt-free when my neighbors were leveraged and panicking. You can do the same thing, but only if you stay out of debt. Only if you resist the pressure to get big fast. Curtis paused. The implement dealers are going to tell you that you need the newest, biggest, most powerful equipment to succeed. But what they won't tell you is that every farmer who's lost their land in the last 20 years believed exactly that. They upgraded, they expanded, they modernized, and when the markets turned, they lost everything. So what do? You farm small, you live cheap, you save aggressively, and you wait, because farms come available every few years, families sell out, banks foreclose, and when that happens, you're ready with cash while everyone else is drowning in payments. Kevin Ross took Curtis's advice, bought a used Massey Ferguson for $2,800, farmed his 80 acres for 6 years, saving every extra dollar. In 1993, a neighboring farm went up for sale. 200 acres. Kevin paid cash. In 2001, another farm. 320 acres. Kevin paid cash. By 2010, Kevin Ross owned 600 acres, all debt-free, all bought by following the exact strategy Curtis Warner had taught him. The pattern repeated, the knowledge transferred, the wisdom survived. Curtis Warner retired from active farming in 1998 at the age of 66. He leased his land to Kevin and 2 other young farmers he'd mentored. Good kids, hard workers, guys who understood the difference between looking successful and being successful. The 1952 Farmall M finally got retired in 2000. 48 years old at that point, nearly 10,000 hours on the meter. Curtis parked it in a shed on his original farm, covered it with a tarp, and let it rest. That tractor bought me everything I have, he told Margaret. Seems like the least I can do is let it retire with dignity. Here's the thing about this story that I need you to really understand. Curtis Warner didn't get wealthy by being the best farmer. He didn't have the highest yields or the most efficient operation or the newest technology. He got wealthy by understanding one simple truth. In farming, survival is more valuable than productivity. His neighbors optimized for maximum production. Curtis optimized for maximum survival. And when the bad years came, when fuel prices spiked and crop prices crashed and banks got nervous, the farmers optimized for production went under. But Curtis, optimized for survival, was still standing with cash in hand. If this story is resonating with you, if you're starting to see your own life differently, do me a favor and share this video. Because this message, this understanding that debt is dangerous and patience is powerful, this is something people need to hear. In 2015, the local Historical Society did a feature on Curtis Warner and his 1952 Farmall M. They brought a photographer out, took pictures of Curtis sitting on the old tractor, interviewed him about his career. "Mr. Warner," the interviewer asked, "if you could go back to 1967 and give yourself advice, what would you say?" Curtis thought about it for a long time. Thought about Mike Shepard and all the other farmers who'd lost everything. Thought about the choices that had seemed so small at the time, but had created such massive consequences. "I'd tell myself exactly what I already knew," he finally said. "That the implement dealers are salesmen, not financial advisors. That banks profit from your debt, not your success. And that the goal isn't to impress other farmers. The goal is to still be farming when they're not. And the old Farmall, you'd make that same choice? Every time. Because that old Farmall represented a decision to value ownership over appearance, independence over efficiency, survival over growth. And that decision, that one choice in 1967 to keep my paid-for tractor instead of financing a new one, that's the choice that let me buy 1,100 acres of land that my neighbors lost. He paused, looked at the old tractor sitting in the shed. Everybody wants to talk about the land I bought, about how I ended up with one of the biggest operations in the county, but nobody wants to talk about the 20 years before that, the 2 decades of being laughed at, of being called cheap and old-fashioned and behind the times, of watching my neighbors drive shiny new tractors while I nursed along a machine that was older than some of their kids. But you knew, the interviewer said, you knew it would work out. Curtis shook his head. I didn't know anything. I was just scared of debt, just trying to play it safe, just doing what made sense to me even when everyone said I was wrong. And you were right. I was lucky. Lucky that the bad years came when they did. Lucky that my neighbors made the choices they made. Lucky that I had cash when land came available. He smiled. But I made my own luck by staying out of debt, by being patient, by understanding that in farming, the tortoise beats the hare every single time. Curtis Warner passed away in 2019 at the age of 87. He died on the same land he'd bought in 1948, surrounded by family, at peace with a life well lived. At his funeral, Kevin Ross stood up to speak. Curtis Warner taught me that wealth isn't about how much you make, Kevin said. It's about how much you keep. He taught me that success isn't about having the biggest operation. It's about still having an operation when everyone else has sold out. He taught me that the implement dealers and the banks and the input suppliers, they're all playing a game where they win and farmers lose. And the only way to win is to refuse to play their game. Kevin paused, looked out at the crowd of farmers and families and friends. In 1967, Curtis's neighbors bought new tractors on credit. Curtis kept his old Farmall and saved his money. 20 years later, Curtis owned their farms. That's the whole lesson right there. Patience beats leverage. Ownership beats appearance. Survival beats growth. And an old Farmall M properly maintained can be the foundation of an empire. So let me leave you with one final question. What are you financing right now that's preventing you from building wealth? What payments are you making that could be savings instead? What could you buy in 10 years if you stopped spending today? Because Curtis Warner's story isn't special, it's not unique, it's not unrepeatable. It's just the story of a man who understood that debt is dangerous, patience is powerful, and an old tractor that's paid for is worth more than a new tractor that owns you. Drop a comment below and tell me what you learned from this story. And hit that subscribe button if you want more content about farming, wealth building, and the power of living below your means. I'll see you in the next one.